In this video, we'll be looking at 5.3, the properties of operations. So go ahead and turn to 5.3 in your notes packet. Okay, so we're going to have to write some definitions, and our essential question will be, how can I use the properties of operations to make math easier? How can I use the properties of operations to make math easier? So we'll write our definitions with some examples of each property. Commutative property changes the order of the numbers in multiplication and addition. Changes the order of the numbers in multiplication and addition. So some examples would be, if I had A times B, that would be equal to B times A. That's if we use letters. We could also use numbers and say, well, 4 times 3 is equal to 3 times 4. With addition, we could say A plus B is equal to B plus A, or we could use numbers and say 5 plus 7 is equal to 7 plus 5. And that's the commutative property. Next, we'll do the associative property. The associative property moves parentheses when multiplying or adding. So an example of that could be is A times B, A times parentheses, B times C is equal to parentheses A times B times C. If we had real numbers, we could say something like 5 times 3 times 7 is equal to 5 times 3 times 7. And see how the parentheses moved and grouped different numbers. So you can do that when you're multiplying or adding. And the same is if we're adding, we can have A plus parentheses B plus C is equal to parentheses A plus B close parentheses plus C. So we can plug in numbers and say 2 plus 7 plus 9, the 7 plus 9 in parentheses. And if I move those parentheses, I can move them so that they're around the 2 plus 7 and then plus 9. Next, we'll have the additive identity. And the additive identity is when we we add 0 to a number, the value of that number does not change. So what this would look like if we were using letters, we could say a plus 0 equals a. And if we were using numbers, we would say 5 plus 0 equals 5. The multiplicative identity is similar to the additive identity because we're just not going to change the value of a number. So if we multiply a number by 1, if we multiply a number by 1, the value of that number does not change. So say I had a times 1, that would equal a. Or if we're using a number, we could say 12 times 1 is equal to 12. So we're multiplying by 1, and the number or the letter that we're multiplying by does not change. It stays the same. So a stayed a, and when 12 times 1, 12 stayed 12. The multiplicative property of 0 is if we multiply any number by 0, the answer is 0. So we could show this with a letter. If I had a times 0, anything times 0 will be 0. So if we have an example using a number, we would say 43 times 0 equals 0. Doesn't matter what the number is, it will always equal 0. So with the inverse property, we have two different inverse properties. We have the inverse property of addition and the inverse property of multiplication. So the inverse property of addition is where if I add the opposite to a number, so a plus negative a equals 0. An example using real numbers would be if this number is, say, 13, what's the opposite of 13? Negative 13. So if we add those two together, we get 0. So that's the inverse property of addition. Now we can also have the inverse property of multiplication. So the inverse property of multiplication is if I take a number, so any number, we'll represent it with a, and I multiply it by 1 over a, that will equal 1. So an example using numbers would be if I had, say, 1 over 17. I apologize. If I had 17 and I multiplied it by 1 over 17, that would equal 1. So that is the definition of all our properties. Let's do some examples. We'll just do these 6 examples and then we'll be done with these notes. Okay, on my first example, I have 3x plus 0 equals 3. So let's go back to our notes and find where is it where I add 0. I'm adding 0 and I get the same thing. Whatever I started with the 3x, so I have 3x to end. So let's find it. Where am I adding 0, and whatever I start with is what I'm going to end up with. Well, I don't see any adding 0 in the commutative property, so it's not that. Associative property is just moving parentheses, so it's not that. Additive identity, we add 0 to a number, and the value of that number does not change. So I added 0 to something, and I got that. So on this example, a plus 0 equals a. So it's very similar to this example, 3x plus 0 equals 3x. Whatever I started with, the 3x, adding 0, I get the same thing. So this will be our additive identity. On number 2, we are changing the order of addition. So which property lets us change the order of addition? Because we have 42 plus x plus y equals 42 plus y plus x. So that x and y switch places. We change the order of x and y. Okay, so let's go through our properties, starting with the first one, commutative property. Changes the order of the numbers in multiplication and addition. So this example right here, a plus b is equal to b plus a. So we can change the order of the numbers or the letters, the variables, in our addition. So let's look at that. And I go, oh, well, x plus y changed order, so that is my commutative property. On number 3, it says d times e times 0 equals 0. So we're looking for a property where if we multiply a bunch of things together, or if we multiply some items together and then we multiply by 0, we equal 0. So we're looking for multiplication times 0 equals 0. So where do we see that? It's not the commutative property, that's where we switch the order. Associative property moves parentheses, so it's not that. Additive identity, we add 0, but that's not multiplying by 0, that's adding 0, so it's not that. Multiplicative identity, we are multiplying, but we're multiplying by 1, not 0. So we're looking for something where we're multiplying and there's a 0. So we were close with additive identity, we had the 0, but we weren't multiplying. We're close with multiplicative identity because we're multiplying, but we don't have a 0, shucks. And then, multiplicative property of 0. So we're multiplying by 0 and it equals 0. So we're multiplying by 0 and it equals 0. So that's our multiplicative property of 0. Multiplicative property of 0. Okay, just 3 more to go and then we'll be done. Let's look at number 4. 9 plus negative 9 equals 0. So we started off with the number 9, then we added its opposite, negative 9, and we equal 0. Well, I can kind of see that from right here. We're starting off with a number, we're adding its opposite, and it equals 0. So right here in this inverse property of addition, that's where we're starting with a number, adding its opposite, and equals 0. So that's our answer. We're going to use the inverse property Our next one, we're going to take negative 34 times 1 equals negative 34. So we've multiplied a number by 1, and the value has not changed. That value stayed the same. So let's see. Commutative property, we just changed the order, so it's not that. We're trying to multiply by 1 and get the same value. Associative property, we move parentheses, not multiplying by 1. Additive identity, we're adding 0, still not multiplying by 1. Multiplicative identity, a times 1 equals a. Okay, so if we multiply 12 times 1 equals 12, we took 12, multiplied it by 1, and the value stayed the same. So if we have negative 34 times 1 and the value stays the same, that's going to be our multiplicative identity. Okay, our last example. So I have 9 parentheses a times b parentheses equals parentheses 9 times a parentheses times b. So let's see. We're looking for, so this is always whenever we have numbers next to letters, we know it's multiplication, so it's right in our multiplication. So we have 9 times parentheses a times b is equal to parentheses 9 times a parentheses times b. So we're looking for, it looks like the parentheses started around the a times b, and then the parentheses moved, these parentheses moved to where they're around the 9 times a. So where is a property where we're moving parentheses? So we have the commutative property where we can change the order. We're not changing the order, we're moving parentheses. Associative property moves parentheses when multiplying or adding. Okay, so there it is. We're moving the parentheses when we're multiplying. So that's our property we're going to use. So we will use the associative property. And that will be it for this video. That is 5.3, Properties of Operations. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.